Welcome. Welcome to A Taste of Justice. I'm Professor Angela May Kupenda. For informational purposes only, I will tell you I'm a professor at Mississippi College School of Law, but all explanations here of these cases are my own, and they are not to be ascribed to my school or to my students. Okay, let's get to it. In this series, we are examining the First Amendment. The First Amendment is a short little amendment, but there is so much case law interpreting this amendment. There are some basic principles we talked about in the first couple of clips. One principle or one rule we examined is this: generally, the government may not regulate the content of pure speech unless government satisfies a high level of review called strict scrutiny, or unless the speech is in an unprotected category. If the speech is in an unprotected category, government may, if it chooses, regulate it at a very low level. All government has to have is a legitimate governmental interest, and the regulation or restriction on the speech just rationally related to that interest. That's a low level of review by the court. Now, we started out by looking at some of the categories of unprotected speech. This is maybe the third clip or so on a category called speech that advocates illegal action. Now, we look first at the historical cases. Many of the historical cases were during war times. There was less protection of First Amendment rights, especially of speech that had a great potential for being effective. The court said that government had the right to stop the fire before the fire happened. And so there was much speech placed in the unprotected category of speech that advocates illegal action. Then we had what is called a modern day test in the Brandenburg case. Now, we didn't suddenly get to Brandenburg. There was a progression as the court moved toward Brandenburg. But in the Brandenburg case that I talked about on the last clip, Brandenburg is considered to be the modern day test about speech that advocates illegal action. The court said this, that for speech to be unprotected, it must be advocacy. It can't just be a little discussion or a simple teaching, or just a membership in a group, possibly. It must be advocacy. Advocacy directed to inciting. The speech must be directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and is likely to incite or produce such action. So you see, with a test like this, less speech is going to be placed in an unprotected category. But this test is still broad enough to include advocacy directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and is likely to incite or produce such action, the Brandenburg test. Now, one of the justices who concurred in that opinion said, well, we're in times of peace now. And in the last clip, we debated that a little bit, but that we were in a time of peace. And Justice Douglas said, in times of peace, you can protect speech more. Now, keep in mind that Brandenburg test, and make sure you take a look at the notes I've typed in the text box below this video, just so you can go back, Google some of this material. My students can go back to the cases, and you can provide a check on me to see if I told it to you just right, if I explained it to you correctly. Make sure you always check the person who is informing you and be a critical listener or a critical student. Now, the court was then faced with a challenge. Now, many of us can remember where we were on 9/11. We can remember the terror attack that occurred on US soil. And for those of you who are very young, you no doubt have heard a lot about it. And if you don't really understand what all happened, all you have to do is Google some various news sources, check more than one, and you can read about it and you can see the pictures and you can see the terror attack that occurred. Now, after 9/11, people were very afraid. They were afraid that another attack could occur. They were afraid that they're now engaged in a war and they really don't know, this war on terror, what does that mean? And I think people were afraid because some people, not everyone, but some people had never really felt unsafe in America. So it was a new feeling for some. So the question became, how many or how much of our constitutional rights and liberties do we cede to the government in order to feel less afraid? This thing about fear that some of the justices talked about in the historical opinions. Oh, all kinds of things were happening. We had more airport security. At that time, my hair was a little longer and it often would be searched along with the hair of many other individuals who had curly hair. Sometimes the library lists were checked to determine what types of books people were using. All kinds of security was added so that we could feel safer in the country. So there was much debate in civil rights circles and professors and others, how much of our constitutional rights and liberties and freedoms and privacy do we give up to the government in order to feel more secure? So there was great debate. Now, we have the Brandenburg test, right? The Brandenburg test protecting speech, that's in order to go into an unprotected category, the speech must be advocacy directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action and is likely to incite or produce such action. But then we have 9/11. So a case came before the court in 2010. I give you the name of the case down in the text box, Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. And the case is lengthy and I find it quite complex, but I want to simplify it a bit here for you. but you can go online and you can pull the full opinion and read it for yourself. So the federal government and the state governments, many people were concerned about safety. So the federal government passed a law. Let me go back. First, the federal government designated certain groups to be foreign terrorist organizations. The federal government had a process by which they would do to determine whether or not a group was a foreign terrorist organization. So there was this group that was designated in this way, a foreign terrorist organization. So Congress had passed a law that prohibited anyone, citizens, anyone, from providing material support of resources to any group that has been designated a foreign terrorist group. You could not provide support, you could not provide resources to that group. Now, there was a group of plaintiffs who brought suit. They said, okay, you have this group that you're calling a foreign terrorist group. The plaintiffs said, even if that is true to some degree, but they were not really ceding all of that, but even if it was true to a degree, they said that group also did humanitarian work within the legal system. These plaintiffs wanted to help the group, not in terms of the terror, but this group of plaintiffs wanted to help this group to learn to use the legal system, and they wanted to help them in terms of the humanitarian work they were doing for others. The plaintiffs said that if they can do that, this group that was a foreign terrorist group, according to the federal government, they could really convert this group into being a lawful group that used the legal system to bring about, to effectuate change and to do humanitarian efforts. But they didn't want to do this if they were going to end up in jail. So they filed suit to ask the court this question. Here's the group the government has designated as a foreign terrorist group. The plaintiffs want to show the group how to use the law. They want to help the group with humanitarian efforts, and they believed it would make the group's terror activities subside, and it could bring about change that the group wanted, but in a lawful way. Now, what do you think the government said? The government said, no, no, no. The government said no. If you help the group with its lawful activities, the government argued, you're still helping the group. And if you're helping a group designated as a foreign terrorist group to have some legitimate activities, what might happen is the foreign terrorist group may grow. It may grow and become even bigger in a terror-like way. It could, the government said, it might, it could. Now note, the plaintiffs are saying if we do this, the group is going to become more peaceful. The government is saying, no, if you bring in all these resources and help them in this way in their humanitarian efforts to learn how to use the legal system, they could just as well become a bigger terrorist group. Now, I guess I could have done a PowerPoint on this for you to help you, but you just have to see it with my hands and read the notes. So here we had this case. Now the plaintiff said that they should be allowed to do this under the Brandenburg test. The Brandenburg test said that speech is not unprotected unless it is advocacy directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and is likely to. They said our work will be humanitarian work, the plaintiffs, and we're going to show them how to use the law legally and peacefully to effectuate change. But the government is saying, no, they may take those resources and spend all of that into becoming a larger terrorist organization. So what do you think the court held? We have the Brandenburg test. The plaintiffs made some very strong arguments. What do you think the court held? The court ruled in favor of the government. It's a foreign terrorist designation, the court said. The federal government has designated as such, the court said. The Congress and the executive agree, according to the court. And so therefore plaintiffs, no, you cannot associate with them in that way. If you do, you violated this law, and therefore there could be actions brought against you. But then the court added something. They said, okay, you want to do all of this. We have this foreign terrorist group. You want to do all this nice stuff. The court said, tell you what, do the nice stuff, but do not be connected with that organization. You must create a separate group to do the nice stuff, a separate group that is not a foreign terrorist group, and you can carry out those purposes. But if you're affiliated with this group, then you're providing support to them. Now that's what the majority of the court held. There was a strong dissent. I believe three justices dissented. And they said, now hold up. Brandenburg is the test. And the government is saying that if you try to show them how to be peaceful, they could. And the foreign group might get bigger. It could get bigger. It might get bigger. The dissenting justices said that does not satisfy the Brandenburg test. These plaintiffs ought to be allowed to do this without being in violation of the law, pursuant to their First Amendment rights. But the court held no. Now, I have some questions for you. Does this case mean that Brandenburg is no longer the test? Does this test, that's what the court did, which sounds like the historical cases that I explained to you a couple of clips ago, remember the long clip? Does this mean that Brandenburg is no longer the test and we are going back to the historical cases in terms of their less protected view of speech? Does this case only apply to foreign terrorist groups? What about domestic terror? What about homegrown domestic terror groups within the United States? Does this case, Holder versus humanitarian law, also apply to them? If it also applies to them, then that is sounding something like Whitney, but domestic terror can also be quite serious, just as foreign terror. So what did the court, well, we know in this case, we know what the court did. The court deferred to government. The court seemed to sidestep the Brandenburg test, but we don't know what are the long-term implications for this holding as related to foreign terrorist groups and also as related to domestic terrorists. I know you're waiting on me to answer, and I'm waiting on you to answer. I'm waiting for you to think about this. And if I had a definitive answer, I would give it to you. I would offer it or suggest it. But I just have questions. Remember, learning is key. Learning and critically thinking about situations. And when I say critically reading, I don't mean necessarily just finding fault. I mean reading with open eyes and open mind, and looking and analyzing the language and thinking about consequences of cases and of First Amendment rights. I mean, learning is a key to enlightenment. And I believe enlightenment is a key to our achieving the promises of the Constitution. We, the people, in order to establish justice, or at least a taste of justice. Now, in terms of speech that advocates illegal action, we have the historical cases, we have the Brandenburg test, the modern test, then we have this post 9/11 case for us to consider in our analysis and our applications. We're going to put a peg there, as my grandparents used to say, on speech that advocates illegal action. And the clips I'll bring to you probably in a week from now will be about another category of unprotected speech, defamation. Look, those cases are just as interesting. We're going to start with a case called New York Times versus Sullivan. It was during the civil rights movement, and a group of individuals had a paid ad in the New York Times. A number of people signed on to the ad. The ad was in favor of racial equality and peaceful measures to assure racial equality. The ad was even signed by a former First Lady of the United States and many other well-known people in many different fields. But a sheriff, a police commissioner out of Alabama brought suit and said the ad had some inaccuracies and hurt his reputation. So he sued for defamation. So we're going to look at defamation as an unprotected category of speech, and we're going to talk about how the court resolved that issue. And if the court resolved it in a way that you believe is correct, or is good, or is helpful toward the First Amendment and toward racial equality. Again, thank you for joining me. I'm Angela May Kupenda. This is A Taste of Justice. I want you to subscribe and sign up for notifications. You do not want to miss a bit. Thank you.